Before we start tonight's conversation with Tyler Brule, I wanted to pass on some sad news. I don't know that you've caught up with it. The wonderful photojournalist Philip Jones Griffiths died today. He was 72 years old. He's been battling cancer for some time. He was here in late January for what was a really memorable farewell night, actually. He was a giant, as you all know, in the world of photojournalism. Those images from Vietnam, those that suffered because of Agent Orange are there. Those images are there because of the work of Philip Jones Griffiths. I should point out also that he was quite an active member of this club. He loved coming here, and again, was one of the reasons why this place does have such a role in the community, because of wonderful practitioners like him who were willing to give up their time and talk about what they do. And Tyler, it's so timely in the sense of what is in your new issue is a celebration of film as opposed to the digital image, and it's something I just looked up an interview that Philip had done recently with The Guardian, and it was a point he was making, that film was the authentic image. And you have made it quite a considerable part of your magazine.
It's interesting because we, 1 year in, and a lot of it has to do with spending probably considerable time in Japan, we were looking at what was coming in from our contributors from the Japanese market, and it seemed that all of the outstanding stories from a quality point of view, forget about the subject, but just when you saw the image hit the page, and of course I'm not close to always what's coming in on the picture desk, so I'm seeing them on screen, so they might have come in digitally or they might have been scanned, they might have come on film, and it struck me that there was just this richness and there's a wonderful sort of density that I think you get in films, and then I started to look at magazines from 5 or 6 years ago, and when of course there was obviously most of what was hitting page was on film at that time, and I just thought let's actually devote a good part of our issue. Let's make a cover story on the subject, because I think it cuts to the core of one of the craft messages that I think we try to bring out in every issue on some level. And it's interesting when you start to look at how Fuji is really the last company left standing fighting this battle now. And then as you go along, we found this wonderful story about there really is quite a digital backlash actually in the country, which gave it to us being Japan. And it's curious that you've got photojournalists who really want to they want to continue, and they're thrilled that they can get commissioned on film, because a lot of people only want to commission on digital.
He was making the point that the one thing that is true is that you cannot fake a negative. You can fake a digital image, but you can't fake a negative.
True. And then I think also what's what we found fascinating doing this story is, just look at magazines today, and something as simple as party pages, and you see digital images, and everyone's life has been sucked out of them. They're missing they're missing skin tones, they're missing expression and facial features, not just because they've had too much surgery or too much Botox. But people actually looked better in party photos 5 years ago. Portraits looked better than they do today. And I said, maybe this period that we're in right now would be remembered as, a time when, the individual, I think, sort of lacked a certain type of expression. So hopefully, well, and it's two sides. There are some people who work very well on digital, no question, but I think there's been this great rush to move to digital. And on one side, repro companies haven't caught up, or commissioning editors haven't caught up. But I think we're all in a very strange time in terms of what's hitting the page.
Those of you who want to fight with Tyler about any of these issues, let me see your hands early on. We're going to speak for a while. Tyler is going to talk more about the making of Monocle and how he got to Monocle. But if you have a burning question, put your hand up and identify who you are and ask it. Out of curiosity, how many of you have actually seen a copy of Monocle, are familiar with it? Well, that's good. That's good. That's a pretty good. How many are actually subscribing to it? That's not as good.
Could do better. Yeah.
How many of you are members of the Frontline Club? Also could do better in this room as well. It's as hot and trendy as Tyler's magazine. Well, what you've done, though, is fascinating to a lot of people because you defied all the odds. You've challenged every conventional wisdom that's out there about the interest in international news, and also challenged the idea that you can't make a profit out of it, which maybe you're quite not.
Some months.
Is not there yet. But what led you to take the decision that you, Tyler Brule, could craft a magazine that relied so heavily on international news of a kind, and I want to pursue it.
Sure.
How you define international news. What led you to that decision that you could make it in a world that has seen American network bureaus being closed down, big magazines for the Sunday newspapers in Britain no longer commissioning international stories, and yet you flew in the face of all of that conventional wisdom and decided to launch this? Why?
Stubbornness on one side, and perhaps just pursuing a dream. I grew up in Toronto. Well, that's the shorthand. I actually grew up in Winnipeg, and no one knows where Winnipeg is.
How many people know where Winnipeg is? Yeah, okay. See,
that's not so bad.
It's not
more than subscribers. So
it's a very big Canadian crowd here, I think, tonight.
This is true. No, but I growing up, the Toronto portion of my life, my Aunt Anita, the Estonian side of the family, she used to be just a subscriber to Der Spiegel, and I remember being 5, 6, 7 years old, going over to her house on a Sunday and just, flipping through all of these fantastic magazines. And she also had a subscription to Stern as well. And I just loved, I loved photojournalism, and these magazines were just, they took you somewhere that National Geographic didn't take you. And not that I read German, but they were just, and they were very different. They were different beasts than Newsweek or Time, and I remember those magazines lying around because these were magazines that were weekly and they were 300 pages. So that type of title has always been a fascination of mine. When I came to the UK in 1989, I was very surprised that, of course, we have The Economist in this country, but it wasn't very visual. And I would ask people, why has no one launched a real serious heavyweight visual news weekly, and people had pointed to various failed ventures. Yet you look across the channel and Panorama and L'Espresso, and you would look at of course what Germany has, and I mean at that point it was just Der Spiegel and Stern, and then Focus came along as well, which everyone started to copy, and somewhere along the way, that dream went away, and I got into television and radio and various things, and then this wonderful
Wallpaper.
Yeah, and there's sort of this funny accident called Wallpaper came along, and I pursued that. But this is the magazine I've always wanted to do. And going, I guess, to the second part of your question, I came to London. Well, I arrived in Manchester in '89, but got to London in 1990 after being with the BBC. And my first job in London was with ABC News in their old bureau on Carburton Street, when they had 140 plus staff there, but 6 correspondents. Pierre Salinger was the bureau chief. You had 6 dedicated crews. I mean, it was that time when Fitzrovia was full of international networks, and it was a wonderfully it was just a wonderfully exciting time, and we've all watched it in this city, just the general erosion of certainly cutbacks across the board. With you cited U.S. networks earlier, but I think that's been with so many news organizations, and I think a lot of people look to U.S. media and think, okay, well, if the Americans are doing it that way, then we need to follow the decisions that are being made at NBC Universal, or the decisions that are being made by Disney to make cutbacks at ABC. So therefore, it should apply to what happens, at a Hong Kong station or with an Australian network. And I've always been fascinated by, buy international news. I grew up in Canada, a great follower of the CBC, remembered newspapers that had, a good 5 or 6 pages of international coverage every day. And, of course, when I return home to Canada, I see that, those pages are gone. The correspondents' names are no longer there. They're agency stories. So something suggested Heathrow doesn't get any quieter. None of the major hubs get any quieter. People are traveling more than ever before. So, I said one thing was this very selfish desire to do this magazine, or a stubborn desire. But the second thing was just looking at the market. We live in a more mobile society. Yet, if we flip on News 24 in this country, there's no sense of actually a wider Europe or even a wider world. I mean, the news agenda is so narrow. It's a crime that in the morning, they used to have News 24 anchors, obviously, hosting from 6 to 9 o'clock. Now they run BBC Breakfast, which is, you have no sense of what's going on. They've gotten rid of poor Moira, or whoever used to read the news. And you've got Mr. Strictly Come Ballroom and whoever is filling in next to him that day. And, they whiz through the 4 or 5 main stories. And those 4 or 5 main stories are usually domestic, which I think, so right there, we talk about the BBC, but, for the people who live in this country, again, you wake up in the morning, and I'm more of a morning television person, and there's nothing there for me, and I can only choose between, let's say, BBC One and News 24, and I don't have Sky yet, but hopefully the Sky Man will come by next Wednesday, and that's even the reality here. And I mean, we like to point our fingers across the Atlantic and say, oh, look what they're doing in America, but I've got to say, state of affairs isn't much better here. So that presented an opportunity to deliver our take. It's not everyone's take, but our take on a different type of global briefing in print, and as people can see up on the screen, also doing something very different online as well. But yeah, anyway, but that's, and it was interesting. We took the idea to market, and I thought I could fast track the idea and maybe go to 1 or 2 publishers and see if they wanted to do it. And someone very arrogantly said, well, you know what, Tyler, it's a magazine that you would read and I would read and all of our friends would read it, but no one else would read it. And that just astounded me, that comment. I thought, right, I don't want to go down this road pitching to media companies. And then we did talk to 1 or 2 VCs and private equity firms, and they, the smarty pants 22-year-olds, who are running, these funds.
They're not in your demographic?
They're a little south of our demographic, probably. But, who are spending the money of Norwegian ship owners, or not in our case. They said, well, there's no future for print. And, we're 100% behind media, but it has to be digital media exclusively. And I thought, not going to be talking to you either. So we went down the route of just finding private individuals to back the venture. And I think it's important to point out we're a wholly independent operation.
But when you pitched in the United States, you had some curious responses, right?
Yeah, when we had most of the money in place, then of course you have to start looking for advertisers. And so of course we'd go and see a lot of agencies in the States, and we started in New York. And we were looking for 2 things. Of course, we wanted to talk to advertisers. We're also trying to hire a PR company to PR the brand. And across the board in 2 days, we just heard, fantastic magazine, love the concept, looks great. And we just had a dummy to show at that point. The paper's wonderful. It's everything a magazine should be. The only thing we would change for the U.S. is if you just take out the international content, because no one's interested in international content. So I said, well, we'll have a coloring book then, or a sketchbook at that point. And it's interesting when you're on, because America's our biggest market for subscribers.
Which, do a little riff on, as we sit here, you're sold in
probably 50 plus. On the newsstand, 50 plus countries, subscribers in 87.
And your print run is how many copies?
150,000.
And you actually sell?
Probably 80 to 90,000.
And subscriptions?
7,000 plus as of this morning.
And the aim is what? Do you have a trajectory on that you need to get to?
Well, I'm thinking, God, if The Economist is doing 1 million, heavily discounted because we don't discount. In fact, we charge extra. It's a shameless plug. We are going to be selling the magazines at a discount this evening. That's just single copies, not subscriptions. But no, what's interesting is, as well is we do charge $150 or US or £75 for a subscription. Now, if you bought the 5 issues on the news, or sorry, 10 issues a year on newsstand at £5, of course, it'd be 50 quid a year. But we do believe that there is a value in what we're delivering online, and so we charge a premium for that. And so basically behind the wall on the site, there's a component for our subscribers as well, but yeah, we charge a premium for that. So no golf caps, no cheap alarm clocks or things like that.
But you were quoted as saying real journalism is expensive.
I believe so, yeah.
How does that translate in terms of what your concept of real journalism?
Well, I think our concept of real journalism, sending over 95% of the time, probably 98% of the time, our own writer and our own photographer, because the magazine is a visual one. So, and sometimes also sending a video journalist as well. That also means being able to look after our correspondents on the road, so making sure that we have the necessary insurance, but also making sure that we're putting in the investment that we can also sustain them on the road as well. And the comment I guess I made the comment in Media Week 2 weeks ago, because I go to a lot of it. I wear my editor's hat, but I've also got the CEO chairman's hat on as well. So I do a lot of advertising meetings, and you go and speak to a lot of these big agencies, and they say, well, if I go into GQ or Fortune's giving me this much and this kind of added value, but I said, yeah, but the pictures have been bought by an agency, and if I read that story in that magazine, most of it's been cobbled together by a wires, or drawn from wires. It was probably written in London, and I said it's. The reason it costs X to advertise in our magazine, £10,000 a page, is because we have to send people on the road, and that's the cost of being in this magazine. And if you want to be in, great. And if you don't want to, that's fine too.
So the policy is minimal agency material, or do you
minimal agency?
Minimal.
If there, if we need, a postage stamp size. Portrait of a leader in the state of New South Wales, then obviously we're not going to send a photographer for that. But that probably accounts for really 1.5 to 2% of the pictures in the magazine.
Let's talk a bit about selection, and then those of you who want to get into this, please get a question ready. You obviously have opted to cover things that are not huge conflicts, humanitarian crises, breaking stories. Is that because that's where you feel your readership is and wants stories that are not competing with that material? Or are you also influenced by the fact that perhaps Rolex doesn't want to have an ad next to Darfur victims or Congo? Why have you, and I'm using your search engine, I would put up Iraq, find almost nothing. I would put up Darfur, find almost nothing. Put up Congo, nothing. I would find links to things that would get to them. But you've consciously decided to cover a world that you have determined is of interest to a readership that's not being served. And I just wondered if you could talk about that.
Well, I'd go against that. I think keeping Steve Bloomfield and our photographer on the road in Zimbabwe, while not a conflict, certainly a very hot story, and also one where both of them were chucked in jail as well.
That one I would say, I should have said, is a real exception to what I said.
No, sure. But there are others too. I think we see Darfur, and again, we spent a lot of time just doing the whole other side, which is let's look at Sudan, but also what's actually going on in Khartoum as well, and how this country is trying to fashion its own mini Dubai. So it's not being in the front lines, but it's certainly telling a very relevant story, and something which I think exposes many things by looking at what the government, in Khartoum is trying to do. I think sending someone like Rachel Morarji to the much more peaceful side of Afghanistan and going to Herat, but actually and delivering a story about the drug palaces which have been which are being erected, and also how a city like Herat is being leveled, and one of the most fantastic ancient cities. It's a culture story, it's a political story, it's a business story. And again, it's one that no one else is doing. So we've been in Afghanistan, and I think that Afghanistan's actually been, has actually been a running theme. So I don't think that we necessarily also have to be covering the same territory, that the dailies and the weeklies are doing. But I certainly think that we've offered our own view on conflicts around the world.
But is it your view, and have you determined that you think mainstream media are neglecting the world and stories about men and women and design and architecture and all of the things and media? You have that probably reflects your own
Sure.
love and passion for media. You have a huge amount about media, and you wonder, are you interested in reading about the publisher in Fredericksburg, Virginia, or how the FAZ has been completely remade with its presses, and being introduced to whether the Telesur correspondent in Washington, how
Sure.
that person's tracking the American election.
Yeah.
Does this reflect your own passion, or is this something you really think there's an appetite for out there?
I think it's both. I think it reflects the passion of all of the journalists and editors who work for us. But I think there is also there's an appetite, and I mean it's curious because when you're on, I think that a lot of people say, God, the magazine's really evolved and the website's really evolved over the last year. Well, of course things do evolve over the first year. People say, what have you changed? And there's so much, it seems very, very different. And I say, rewind a year. I said, if you look what we did with issue 1 to now, we haven't swerved at all. In fact, you've changed as a reader, I think. And we brought something to market which was quite different, and you're comfortable with it now. And in a way, I think a lot of people have grown into it. I think to the first part of the question, though, it's interesting in terms of having and developing a worldview. I think if you look at, let's say, the U.S. news weeklies, international news is Iraq. Afghanistan doesn't even exist. But that is the international story, and watch, and then I think if you go to television and watch CBS or watch NBC, that will be the only foreign story of the day. I'm not saying that it's a case that do we or do we not have to be there, but also I think that there is so much out there in the landscape that's simply not being covered, and that's part of the editorial mission that we've carved.
No, I think there's so many stories in there that I'm sure many of you who are journalists would have loved to have pitched those to your own desk or gotten a commission to do those stories, because they're visual stories, they're great narratives in those stories, but you just can't get a budget to go do it. Right away, someone wants to ask the first question. Hold on, wait for a microphone, and tell us who you are. It might help Tyler figure out whether you're friend or foe.
I met with Tyler once about 3 months ago, but so hi Tyler. Firstly, a comment. I think you shouldn't be embarrassed. I feel like you're a little bit embarrassed about the question that was just asked about what niche you fill, and why aren't you doing the daily news and Iraq and the Afghanistan the same way as maybe the Time magazine or Newsweek or any of these magazines. You're filling a gap that's so needed. You're covering stories that we're all interested in this room. Deal with culture, the falling of a school in Herat. That's a story that's going to be existing in 3 months' time. It's never going to go away. So it's a magazine you can pick up, I probably think, any day of the week. Not that I have picked it up yet, but maybe I will now. Just wanted to know, what type of readers do you think, what's the ABC of your readership? What's the type of person that this magazine's targeted to?
It's interesting because, again, you do a lot of these meetings with advertising or media buying agencies. And of course, that's what they want. They want you to pull out your sketch pad and your pencils and really draw that reader. And as I said, listen, you can go do a readership survey, and you're going to be sitting on British Airways or on Lufthansa, and you're going to add an extra 20,000 euros to your salary, and you're going to add an extra home, to the two that you already have, and you're going to have this wonderful piece of data that you can hand out to an agency. And I'm not a huge believer in research because, I've been doing a few talks, and a lot of media companies want to know, well, how did you research this thing, and who did you take it out to? What company did develop the research for you? And I say, listen, if me and Andrew don't know how to read the room and read the newsstand, and we need to rely on paying people £50, giving them some cookies to tell us what we think of the covers is a big problem. What we did, we went the other way. We gave people a glass of champagne at Christmas. We invited all 1,000 of our subscribers within the M25 to Christmas drinks at our office. We thought, okay, this could either be fantastic or it could be a complete disaster. It was more the former, which was great. And we really, we got to meet them, which was brilliant. And they were, the room skewed a bit more male than I would have thought. We put out a magazine. It should be of interest to anyone. And it's great to see that, at least in the room this evening, it's really is a mixed crowd. But, at our readers' evening, it was more male. But it was a real representation of a very diverse London, though. The crowd was so international.
34 to 39, I think you said in that interview.
I think there were people that were, also north of 50 quite easily. we're definitely editing a magazine for someone who's over 35, even though I think the average age is 27 on the magazine. But it was, it was interesting. More finance. There are more people in finance than I would have thought, which is no bad thing. And a huge interest from people on the aviation side. I think we had every aviation analyst from all of the banks in that room, plus people from the CAA, BAA, and BA, and Virgin. Anyone who was involved with, buying aircraft, leasing them, getting them into the sky, keeping them on time, keeping them from colliding. We're all there as well. So.
The other thing that I'm sure everyone has noticed is that there's a complete celebrity-free zone in your magazine.
Even A celebrities too.
It is. The editorial statement. It's very refreshing. But is that something the advertiser said? Couldn't you just have George Clooney next to the Rolex ad?
No, thankfully, no. That's one good thing, John. Thankfully, that's not come up actually, and I think that the media buying agencies and the brands, they do support that, and they think it's a good thing that we're an oasis from all of the celebrity that's out there.
Yes, and again.
Hi, Ben Knapp. I work for a branding agency.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, Ben Knapp. I work for a branding agency just across the road. I'm a bit of a fan of online, but found it very interesting, very refreshing, the stuff you did on film and launching a print magazine when everyone's going digital. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask you about what you think digital can do beyond Facebook and social media, and what the role of online content and online magazines is going forward. Thanks.
Hopefully, we're representing a good chunk of that on our site. You'll see that monocle.com, for people who haven't been to visit the site, it's really not a place to read, I would say. As much as I love the New York Times in many ways, if I go to their site, when I see that a story goes to, if I see you've got to click over 4 times to read it, it ceases to be of interest. I would really rather than wait for that edition of the paper to come into the office the next day, and then I'll read it in print. We took a view that, let's make the magazine a fantastic, bookish thing to read. And part of, I think, what we've done, which is maybe disturbed a lot of people, and it's interesting because a lot of publishers today say, why is their circulation dropping? I'm wondering why people aren't engaging with print anymore. And of course, when they do their presentation to their board, they'll say, they'll just point to the web and say it's the web's fault. And I would say it's because no, publishers and editors are quite lazy. When you cut on your reproduction budget, when you cut trim size, when you start to print what it should be, an interesting, visually engaging magazine on Bible paper every week, and you reduce the trim size to that of a holiday brochure, you can't blame the web at that point. It's not the web's fault. It's because you've lost your nerve as a publisher, or you've ceased having ideas. And it was interesting when we, I started spending a lot of time in Japan, a bit of time in Korea, and if you look at those markets, it's interesting. I mean, here are highly advanced consumer markets, and it was interesting. I came in from Japan this evening, and on the way to the airport this morning, and I'm using my mobile phone in Japan, and I'm just flipping through like it would, well, I don't have Sky yet, but through my 5 or 6 channels. But on my mobile, just fast, and it's amazing if you actually look at how publishers in a market like Japan and Korea as well are fighting back, and they fought back in a similar way that we are, which is no. Use print in a way where it's tactile, it smells great, change the paper stock, and make it more bookish. I mean, I think if you're going to survive as a publisher today, I think you need to be, at least at the top end of the market, I think you need to be very collectible. When you get to the web, in our view, right or wrong, we've said, let's make it a site for great film. And so what we do is, we're working with, of course, our own producers and directors to do just that, to make 3, 4, 5 minute mini documentaries, and that's where we spend our money, and it's and working on sort of other audio concepts, and I mean for the summer we're really looking at how can we even do something which is like a limited radio concept for readers over the summertime. So that's where we're going with things. As for community, Facebook, etc. We were thanked by our audience, and maybe it's because they're all over 30. I can certainly say in our office, under 27 you're on Facebook, over 27 you're not, but we've been thanked for not actually ramming a community down our readers' throats, and because the conversation is going to exist anyway. I mean, and actually someone sent a note today saying can they get free subscriptions because someone hosts 500 Facebook users and he leads the Monocle, one of the Monocle Facebook sites, etc. No, you can't have a free subscription.
What about Second Life? No Tyler Brule avatar?
No, no, not yet. At least not one I put up. But no, I think that, as I said, I think we don't necessarily have to host the conversation, because the conversation is going to be in this room, and it's going to be at a restaurant across the street, and it's going to be happening elsewhere. So and I think that it's not necessarily something that that we have to be the anchor of.
But you are a traditionalist. You love newspapers. That comes through. You have
Sure.
so many issues. That one issue where you just flat out, I could tell you probably wrote most of that.
No, Rob Bound or we commissioned. But it's interesting because we've got a section called The Baron. I mean, it's about the press baron, and it's been probably in the last 6 or 7 issues, and because there are a lot of interesting people all over the world. You referred to Fredericksburg, or you talked to Michael Ringnier. There's very Theo Vantillo. There's very, very interesting people out there who still make a lot of money doing print. Of course, they have websites, everything else that goes with it. But we just thought it'd be great to actually talk to, these barons, and how do you reinvent yourself if you're a small newspaper in Wisconsin today? We get criticized because we have a culture section, and the magazine is ABCDE, but it's really sort of ABMDE because it's more media. The culture section, and a lot of people say, "Where's the opera coverage?" And we said it's coming, but not under my stewardship. But anyway,
There was a question at the back. I think a person had. Did you have your hand up? All right, then you do.
Hello, my name's Ella Weston. I run a documentary film festival called BritDoc. I just wanted to return to your comment about real journalism and real journalism being expensive. And I really wanted to query whether that was across board for all media and increasingly online media, with certainly free content from the Times or Financial Times or whoever. How does that stick, and where's that going? Where's the future of that? Are we just in a boom period, or is that going to last this out?
Sorry, which component? Sorry.
The free.
Okay,
exactly.
Free on people's sites. Sorry. No, I think it's interesting. There was, of course, a lot of people we've seen try to stick to their guns, and of course wanted to charge for a portion of their site. Now you've got, of course, Murdoch rethinking what he's going to do with the Journal even. So I think there's a lot of discussion out there, and it hasn't worked with Times Premium. I'm convinced, and it was interesting. We had our investors very early on said, okay, commit to a number. How many of these $150 subscribers are we going to get? And I said, I don't know. I said, I just have a hunch that Louis Vuitton or Gucci or Prada, many companies can tack a premium on to a bag which essentially doesn't cost that much money to make, but they've got a good story and they've got a good brand behind them. I think that we can also apply a premium to what we're doing. So 7,000 people at $150 each. Of course, we lose money sending magazines to Zimbabwe, obviously, but we make a lot of money sending magazines to Bath. None of that was on, on our balance sheet early on, and it seems to be working. And I think also because, we're delivering stories that might have been on the ABC in Australia, that maybe once upon a time you would have gotten them on CBS News, but they're not there anymore. So, and I think people are content. And in a way, a lot of actually what you see on our site, most of the video content is free. Some things we do put up behind the wall, and maybe we'll do a series or something. Which and again, I think it continues to work for HBO, and I think it can work for us.
We're here behind you.
Hello, I'm Cornelia Fuchs from Stern magazine. I wondered what the ratio is between staff and freelance photographers and writers.
We did a calculation just after Christmas. We are all in. We are 32 people. So that's 2 in New York. 3 in New York on staff, 1 business, 2 editorial. In Tokyo, 2 editorial people, and that's with our own dedicated bureaus where I think we're paying the rent every month, and then the balance sitting in London. So I think of that 32. There are 23 are editorial. So and when I say business side, that's circulation and accounting and also ad sales. So the business side is very small. I think if we had to count up on the issue, it would probably be. Depends. I mean, sometimes half of it's written by us. It can be even higher than half. So in terms of words hitting page, up to 60. Yeah. So. Does that answer you?
I'm Leslie Lee, and I work for the BBC. You've just talked about who does read your magazine. I want to know who you do write for. Who do you imagine your ideal reader to be?
Hopefully you, Leslie.
I do read it.
No, but I think that when I think of, on one side, and it's just interesting. Walk through any part of London, on a Saturday when people are out with their partners, their kids, whatever, and just the sheer amount of just the languages you hear, and it's incredible how diverse the city is. So on one side, if we could only even survive on London, which we probably couldn't, but on one side we'd like to just appeal to the diversity of the city in that sense. Probably in my mind, I think it's someone who's living somewhere else than where they were born. I come back to this notion of mobility. I think it's someone who's probably been transferred 2 or 3 times over the course of their various careers. I think of as I said, it's definitely dual audience as a title, and I think one thing which at least I'm finding so far, but we always come back to this when we sit down and do story meetings. I think it's about the opportunity as well, and it might be because tomorrow you decide I've had enough of London, and I'd just like to find a better life somewhere. So you can turn to section E, and you could say, look at, I'm just going to go and work for Austrian radio, and I'm going to work at the ORF bureau in Innsbruck, and we did a great story about that. But someone else might look at our business section and say, this is such an amazing convenience store concept that they have in Germany that I'd like to bring it to Korea. So part of it is always trying to look over the horizon, and it's spotting the opportunity, and be that from a global affairs perspective, all the way through to design, and I think that's something which does unite our readership.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm from Pembridge. I have a two-part question. I was wondering if you could recount the story and the thought process leading up to the sale of Wallpaper, and secondly, do you have any sort of exit plans for Monocle?
Wow, I don't think you say. Well, very, very briefly, I found Wallpaper in 1996, got the idea for it in 1994 while recovering from a pair of injuries, staying in Afghanistan, and it never had any idea about, and it was never really interested in actually doing my own media venture, but found myself sitting down with Barclays Small Business one day, and miraculously got one of those funny small business loans for £132,000, which you're supposed to use to set up your own bakery or muffler shop or something. But I got one for a magazine. Did a great business plan, I thought. Of course, a lot of our advertising came from Italy, and so I assumed that, really worst case scenario, that all of my Italian fashion and furniture advertisers would pay within 90 days. 180 days later, we were almost without a magazine, and within the first year anyway, I sold the magazine to Time Warner, and had a 5-year, very straightforward. I had a 5-year deal with them, and that was an earn-out piece. So I kept 12.5% of the magazine, and decided to stay on an extra year, and then in 2002, I sold the rest of the magazine. There was obviously, a contractual trigger for that, but also, the emotional trigger was also, it was one thing to be dealing with reasonably sophisticated people in New York. When Wallpaper was purchased, when Time Warner purchased IPC, I was suddenly dealing with very unsophisticated people across the river. And that was not interesting either, and I could have stayed on, but I chose not to. And then had quite a long, maybe in hindsight, I took the money and the long non-compete, and maybe Monocle would have happened a bit earlier, but I had a non-compete with Time Inc. for some time. So that also prevented me from doing something new. In terms of an exit for this project, no. In many
staff here is all looking at it.
Right. No, no exit plans. I would hope that at some point we can build a tower in St. James taller than the Economist's.
Yes, question back here. By the way, I want to talk about your travel in a minute, because you used to write some very good pieces for the FT and also the Herald Tribune and you just popped off a plane from Tokyo, and you seem to be functioning well. So maybe you can again pass along, your traveler tips.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm actually in the Frontline video journalism training course here at the Frontline Club. I wanted to ask you mentioned HBO, and wondering if you're familiar with current TV, and you're talking about that gap between kind of corporate news and culture/international news. Wondering if you ever have toyed with the idea of doing a network to put your ideas into a television format.
I'm not sure who else is in the room. Yeah, we're obviously thinking about lots of things that we can do digitally. I'm not sure if we would, venture to do a traditional network, but we've been toying with, we've been toying with some audio concepts right now. I think that there's definitely room. One thing when I think about our readers and their media habits. It would be, actually, I was staying at the Peninsula in Tokyo, and they've got a very old school feature, which which they've now, they've reinvented, but I've never seen this in a hotel anywhere in the world. So, at your desk and bedside, in the same way that you used to be able to press like sort of, very old sort of clunky Telefunken radios that you would get, at a 60s hotel in Munich. They've got the same concept, but it's digital, and they've got Deutsche Welle, they've got the World Service, they've got Radio France International, they've got 2 of the NHK channels, and it's great, but it's all internet based, and it's fantastic. I've never seen a hotel doing this, and that.
So extend that thought. I think I heard you saying, monocle the channel.
I think an audio concept I think could be very interesting, and so that's something that we're thinking about. Where that takes us from a visual perspective, let's see. But I think for our audience, I think that let's call it radio, in sort of in an old school analog sense. But yeah, an audio world could be very interesting for us.
Well, why not a web channel? I mean, there's so many taking shape. There's one taking shape in Boston, having to do with print. There are lots of other activities around.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in a way we're doing that, and of course we have to connect it. I think just as a next step, we've got a Tokyo office, and I think certainly with and we've got a relationship with J-Wave in Japan, so I could see that very quickly we could have a setup. To do 6 or 7 hours out of Japan quite easily. Let the day roll over to London, then let it roll over to New York at some point. Could be fascinating. Plus having all of our people in the field. So that's just first step. And
it comes back to stories. You got the stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I was going to say that would take us. That takes us to the first step of then going video. And who knows? Maybe it's against fashion, and maybe you're supposed to go and do video right away, but. With Gillian and my colleagues, sitting up front here, we've just been playing with some interesting, audio ideas. Of course, these things need to be financed as well. And what's interesting, we've mentioned Rolex a couple of times, and not this is brought to you by Rolex, but a lot of those companies, listen, which are so important to everyone from The Economist to us to National Geographic. Let's face it, are also wondering. Where do they take their brand from a media perspective? And I think that audio is the territory, which till now I think has been, stack them high, sell them cheap, car insurance, all of those things. But I think they're also seeing their scope, of course, as the BBC. If you look at the website internationally now, of course, suddenly there's advertising on it. And I think that a lot of them are thinking, where does this go, globally next as well? And so they're toying in that arena. And
is that wrong, by the way, for the BBC to have advertising on it? Does that diminish its...
No, that's not wrong. But having a story about cats, there's always a cat story every week. That's wrong. A, I don't like cats. And B, I think sort of having sort of these cheap type of stories, on the front page, that's wrong. And I think the other thing that's wrong is trying to pass off a BBC documentary about penguins as news. Go plug it somewhere else on the site. You've got a massive, massive website, but I don't think it needs to be on the front page of the news section.
I think you've revealed another aversion. I think pets.
Dog's fine, but we laugh in the office because there's a cat story of the week. It does very well for the BBC, but.
What about crime, by the way? You try to get at it, I guess, in some ways. But what about what I'm struck by the BBC these days is the incredible increase in coverage of crime. Well,
I know who'd moved to this country because it's an interesting comment because when you look at the site, so let's say if I'm on the road and I'm looking on the international site, I almost think that the Home Office needs to be maybe monitoring that part of the site a bit more, just purely from a PR point of view, because if I'm clicking through and I'm sitting in Taiwan and then I get to the UK page, all it is missing children, stabbings, another shooting in South London. You really think the whole joint's falling apart. And of course it's skewed that way because, again, I think that's for the domestic viewership and readership. But there are other stories, I think, also internationally, which are also happening. But I somehow feel it doesn't get filtered through somehow. But
Other questions? Have them ready.
Okay. I'm not a journalist anymore. I've worked for the Telegraph as a researcher in Tokyo in the early 90s. And perhaps because of that, I've become so disillusioned, about journalism. And what do you take real journalism is? Because the market force really has just done so much damage. I mean, I was working under Conrad Black, so that might explain why. Because I want to know, there is the truth, and then also you have to look at different perspective. And Japan, as a result of the Western journalism, it's just become a crazy country with expensive. I mean, how do you deal with that different perspective?
Well,
By the way, press bins in prison could be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think it's interesting, certainly from, and just the fact that, A, that you work for Telegraph, but just bringing up Japan, a lot of people said to us, why did you open your Asia bureau in Tokyo? You should be in China. China's where the story is. But it was actually for the very reason that you cite. It's the land of expensive beer, which is no longer. I think actually London has that title today. But we decided that from a quality of life perspective for our editor out there, I mean, a fantastic base. You can get to probably 19 places direct in China more safely and faster flying out of Narita and increasingly Haneda, than you could even being based, Hong Kong or if you were going to be in Shanghai or Beijing. But the second thing is we decided to go to Japan because, still for, a good stretch, it's still the world's second biggest economy. And yeah, there's so many stories to be told, of course, for the region, but even just in a market like Japan, which are not just about Pokemon and Tamagotchi and all of the crazy things. And I think that's actually one thing which I think our readers really admire, is that we started to just present a different side, as I said, of the world's second biggest market. Going back to the first part of your question, with regard to what's real journalism, from our point of view, where PR and there's so much coercion on the side of advertisers, we pay our own way all the time, no matter what. So there are no freebies. If there's a press trip, then it would be, there can be no strings attached. If we think your product's crap, or if simply have no interest to it, and they know that going in. And if it agrees, great. If we decide to write about it at a certain point, that's fine too. But no matter where we go in the world, we're always footing the bill.
Do you think readers ought to be told more about travel arrangements for everyone who, from the arts to sports to anybody traveling the world on behalf of? I think it's key. Absolutely. I think it's and it is amazing, having been out of magazines for 5 or 6 years, and going back into it, and even again doing more advertising meetings, and people say, oh well, we would like to we actually like to pay for let's say to do a story about our trainers or whatever it may be. And it's like, well, so that's an advertorial, or you talk about 6 pages of advertising, or what do you want? No, we just want paid editorial. It's like, excuse me? But that's happening all the time, and it's amazing talking to, and I don't know, I just it certainly never happened when I was at Wallpaper, and maybe it's happening today, but the amount of times we come up against this right now, and I shouldn't say against it, but just where you encounter that, yeah, if we offer you X, and you put, our car happens to drive by, even in a story, if it's, in the back streets of Tehran, we'll pay for that. Yeah.
It's like, no, not with us. You won't be.
I tried to get a story commissioned for the British Journalism Review on this, and I had some good people who had some great stories, but they decided they couldn't do it. It would be slitting their own throats with their own newspapers. Back here, and then...
Hi there, Henry Hicks. I work for a Futera, a sustainability communications company. As the Chinese curse goes, we live in interesting times. We face huge challenges internationally, nationally, politically, socially, environmentally. Are you excited about the challenges and opportunities sort of the new world represents, and is Monocle as a magazine quite positive and forward-looking, do you feel?
I think if you've been following the magazine, it's one thing we don't sort of have happy clappy editorial meetings. I mean, hopefully they're happy, but not clappy. But it's curious. A lot of readers have said there is a very positive tone of the magazine, or actually I close the magazine and I feel good about the world. And it's, I don't think if you look at, let's say, you know, and there's an editorial mission statement, but you know, positivity or optimism is, you know, wouldn't sit there. But you know, I do think we take, you know, we do take a positive view on the world. I mean, hopefully, you know, we're highlighting the ills along the way. But at the same time, you know, there's an extraordinary amount of discovery to be done. There's inspiring leaders out there to talk to, and I think, you know, sometimes, and it was interesting. The journalist from Stern, but we were in Der Spiegel recently, and, you know, and they said, well, the magazine doesn't really, you know, ask the hard question all the time. And I said, well, A, I disagreed with that, but also I said, I think also sometimes our silence speaks volumes as well. You know, I think there's sometimes there are topics or individuals, you know, they simply don't appear in our magazine because we don't think, you know, they fit our magazine, and they're not worthy of further airing. And maybe that, in a way, makes the magazine seem a little bit more positive because we just, you know, choose to delete certain subjects as well.
But do you think there's another way into some of these intractable conflicts? I mean, we had a story meeting here about an upcoming full week we're going to devote to the Congo. But the storyline really was going to be demystifying what all those numbers mean.
Yeah.
Couldn't Monocle do more of that in terms of tackling these intractable conflicts and finding a way in to make them more accessible?
Sure.
Because it's not as though the mainstream media are giving us that day in, day out.
No, absolutely.
I mean, we did a search on, we had an event in New York, we did a search on the American nightly news for Somalia over 2 years, 0. Congo, 1. Darfur, the 3 big networks, 11 stories.
Sure.
So it's not as though viewers, readers are well served by their own media.
No.
Maybe there is a place for you.
Yeah, I think certainly we can up the tempo in in certain areas. I mean, Kosovo being a good example. You know, again, we had you know, Adam Labor, who's works for us out of Budapest. I mean, for other people as well, but is a regular contributor. Did a piece, and then a gentleman who is a political officer with the UN also did a piece for us. But again, probably giving it more of a monocle take. You know, to be able to actually devote you know, a full page, no images, just to, you know, what would the roadmap look like? Highly subjective, but also someone who's on the ground out there. But what does that look like? And having seen that story on page when I got actually the current issue, or what will be the current issue, come tomorrow when it hits the streets. I just thought it, you know, it felt very right, and we'd like to do more of that.
Other questions, by the way? Think of an area that we haven't really explored with Tyler, if you really, okay, there's one there.
My name is Monica and I work for Bloomberg News, which being a wire is as far as it can get from magazine like Monocle. Now, Monocle feels that ended up in the newsstand to fill a gap for the print side. Now, when it comes to TV, we see 24/7 news channels literally mushrooming. They're coming up every day. And when you flip through the channels, as on Wednesday, you will see Sky News as well, you just get the feeling that instead of having more news, you just get the same story repeated many times. So how do you feel about this 24/7 news channel, which they don't really seem to deliver new stories, just the same story coming from wires, but the video ones?
No, I think it's, you know, a lot of the round-the-clock news services do fall into the same trap of course, you know, every 18 months they get a new suite of graphics and a new suite of sound effects. So they've got to use their whooshes and zooms as much as they can for you know, what's supposed to pass as breaking news. I mean, that's one of the, you know, the main problems. You know, is there's, you know, it seems there's obviously a red button in the control room, you know, which is the whoosh button. to obviously signal that there's a story of supposed importance, and I think they've done themselves a huge disservice. I think one or two of them, or at least one of them, I think to break away, I think needs to move into being more features-led at certain times of the day, and I think it's interesting because as well when you watch something like CNN, well, CNN has got a massive viewership in the Middle East, and I think as we all know, I mean, Sunday is Monday in that region, yet everything comes out of Atlanta, and it seems like sleepy time because everything's gone back to the States over the weekend and does not feel very international or rolling news at all. So it's curious because you've got a lot of networks which are trying to talk to an audience around the clock and are trying to be very international, but yet at the same time still seem like they reside on the opposite side of the Atlantic. The other thing too is just I think the features component as well is that they're like the front page of a newspaper, but they forget about all of the other sections that makes a great newspaper brand.
Do you feel Al Jazeera English has fulfilled its promise? And if it has, why isn't it more of the part of the discussion?
Well, it's why is it not part of the discussion? Because I think a lot of people have not seen it yet. Distribution is obviously a huge issue for them. And yes, they are on Sky,
which you don't have yet.
I don't have, but we have it. But we have in our office, and we put on. We have Al Jazeera on. I would say half the time in our office for the very for that very reason is that you are going. They're not going to be there live when Brittany comes out of hospital. Yet even the BBC falls into that trap. So I think that's.
Has it fulfilled its promise?
I think. If I recall the promises which were to, go and present a different view, to be generous on budgets and open up bureaus around the world and report from interesting places, and hopefully, everyone's got their own statement today about, being balanced and fair and all of those things. If I look at what hits the screen, I feel that they do a pretty good job on the news side. If that was a promise in terms of putting boots on the ground, deploying correspondents over the world, and getting stories out from interesting places, yes. Do I feel that the ruling government, in Qatar, might be leaning on the newsroom a bit at times? But then, I don't think it's any. Is the government of Qatar and its power any different than the power of Disney with ABC News? Not really.
Yeah, just a quick question. My name is Gustavo Antonioni. I'm in consumer products. I'm interested in the physical size of the magazine. How did you come up with the actual size of the product?
How do we come up with the physical size of the magazine? One thing we thought about was just portability. We just wanted something which was, which felt portable, bookish, and of course, we considered paper stock as well. And there were a couple of magazines which I liked on the Japanese market, which were close in size, which I just felt comfortable with. And it's I'd read a quote somewhere about the most loved format is National Geographic, and I think we're slightly wider by 0.75 millimeters and a little bit taller. So that went into it as well, but no more science, no more research, no more 50-pound notes, no more cookies than that.
Thomas Merriman, who do you see as your main competitors for Monocle?
I think, I guess it depends where the discussion's occurring, but from an advertising perspective, I think we get grouped in with, on one side, how to spend it, which is not appropriate. On the other side, The Economist, which isn't really appropriate either. But I say those seem to be from media buying agencies, or from their perspective, those are the two titles that we come up against. On the newsstand, yeah, we live beside The Economist, The New Yorker, sometimes Vanity Fair. But in a curious way, I think that we're a bit of a category buster. We're a different type of title. I mean, when the world's supposed to be very niche, we're very broad. Even though I think our target's quite niche, but I think in terms of subject matter, we're very broad. but I would say that I'm happiest when I see us beside The Economist on the newsstand. The only problem is harder to restock us because we're quite thick. They're weekly. It's an ongoing battle anyway.
Hi, my name is Gary. I'm a subscriber to the magazine. I've got a question.
Thank you, Gary.
A lot of the conversation comparing Monocle with TV has been about 24-hour news channels, which in my mind are completely different in terms of what Monocle is aiming to be. Surely it's much more salient to compare with, say, Arte, the French-German network, in terms of their depth, and also they're looking at different angles on major stories, particularly their thema type.
Yeah.
Is that something you're aiming for? That same sort of view and depth, but also the sort of humanity of the story at times?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I wouldn't even, Arte is one to look at, or I just think of the golden days of Channel 4. If I think of Channel 4 circa 1991 or 1990, when you could flip on Channel 4 at 7 o'clock in the evening and be entertained and informed and provoked between 7 and 11 o'clock. And I just feel that doesn't happen anymore. And also, you would never have to flip the channel. Where television, I don't want to say washed over you, but it was there and it could engage you for a solid 4 hours. And maybe that's the next place we would go, is to actually just deliver a compelling 4-hour block that you could watch on a Sunday morning, or you could watch it on a flight to New York and live with it that way. But yeah, certainly rolling news, and even from an audio perspective, we did something on radio. Maybe news on at the top and bottom of the hour, but in between it should be hopefully as eclectic as the magazine is.
Any other questions? I think we're kind of getting close to the end. Travel tips. You're off a plane. I know you live on planes. You're back and forth to Asia a lot.
Yeah.
How do you do this? Give us your secrets. Although I know one answer, which you already are not probably able to give us because you haven't had a run, or you haven't.
Right. Yeah. I didn't get to have a run this afternoon when I landed. Well, part of it, it helps that I own 70% of the magazine, so no one has to sign my expenses. So I can travel how I feel like, which is important.
I.e., you're not back with the punters in economy, grabbing your monocle and worrying about somebody putting their seat back on you.
This is true. No, but I think that that's certainly one part of it. Okay, well, my favorite airline is ANA, who I flew with today, and it is possible to actually be an airline that has only one flight a day to Heathrow, and consistently I go to Japan about once a month, and you can go from a reasonably close gate through security and actually be at the baggage carousel. And today that happened within 9 minutes from off the aircraft to the baggage carousel, and the bags were there. And sometimes you have to throw people at the problem. Technology is not going to save the day. Because I asked them, I said, how do you do this? I said, British Airways can't do it, American, none of them can do it. And they said, no. They said, we just have 2 people, we have our own van, and we just take the bags and we drive them over ourselves. We don't outsource it. And it is amazing. So sometimes you have to chuck 1 or 2 warm bodies at a problem, and it does fix things. So yeah, ANA is it's certainly my favorite airline. Long haul, short haul Lufthansa. Best airport's Munich in Europe. Again, can show that local government and an airline actually can work together to have a humane solution for travelers. Haneda in Japan probably is the best airport. I think it's the best airport in the world. No one ever hears about Haneda. It's a domestic airport, but I think it's the 4th busiest in the world. But again, you don't have to have security queues. In fact, their whole strategy at that airport is to have lots of security lanes, but in different parts. So instead of funneling 10,000 passengers an hour just through one channel, they've got multiple channels all up and down the airport, which not rocket science, but works incredibly well.
You love Terminal 5, what you've seen of it so far.
I'm concerned though. I wonder if it is going to open next week, because I know there's been there's been marketing in our magazine for it, but British Airways has been very quiet about it. It seems like a bit of a secret. So I'm wondering if it's sort of like the launch of the 787, like when's that plane ever going to fly? Yeah, we'll see.
Before we break up here, I wanted to draw you out a bit about London, because you've done a rating of cities of the world. London featured nowhere in the top 20. We've got a mayoral election, a hot contest coming up in May. What would be the Monocle index for what needs to be done for London, and what do you think these candidates ought to be addressing?
Well, actually, in the new issue, we touch on it. Well, actually, my Ed's letter is pretty much focused on that topic. I mean, I a couple of things. I mean, it doesn't just come down to it's not just on a local level, but I think so much which drives decisions in the city. I think also goes all the way up to the top as well. But I think we have to. We have to get infrastructure in order. I think it's wrong. I don't think you can have a mayor of a city who on one side wants to. I'm talking about our current mayor who wants to make this city world class and world player, to stay in the game, and then come out in a very cheap way and then say, well, we're not going to have a third runway at Heathrow. When Frankfurt's building a fourth runway and Munich's building a third, and I think Schiphol must have 10 runways by this point. It is important, and we can have all the discussions we want about the environment, but people are still going to continue to fly, and the role of the city internationally, if it's going to be in the game, it needs to be connected to the rest of the world. And I think in many ways it's grinding to a halt. So it's not just airport, though. It's what do we do with rail. I think it's it's also something as simple as getting around by foot. I mean, I don't want to sound like an old granny, but there is a way of digging up the streets or the pavements, and also replacing the paving stones, or repaving the sidewalk in a way which doesn't throw you on your head if you're at a fast pace. But it is. I mean, I think there's simple detail issues. Certainly, I'm not sure. I sort of think that community. I don't know, the community police officers are what they're called. It's sort of like the law enforcement equivalent of dry cleaning. It's like sort of. I was thinking like dry cleaning is just like sort of blowing a bit of hot air, hoping that the stain or the smell will go away. And I think it's the same thing with these community police officers, whatever they are. It's a presence on the street, but I mean, sort of a rather wet effect, I think. So, and I think as you said, this issue of crime. It's curious being. I was with the mayor's office in Seoul, and it's amazing when a city. Seoul have said. It was interesting. They're talking about their position because a city of over 10 million people. They said, we want to be a top 10 city from a quality of life perspective. And I was thinking, okay, so is this a 25-year plan? They said, no, it's a 5-year plan. They said we want to be there in the economists' list, within the next 5 years. And so you go through all of those things, and it's curious. Crime doesn't come up once. I mean, crime is just not an issue. I mean, yes, there's some limited gang crime in Seoul, but I mean, really. Not, I mean, and it's curious as well how they're so focused on London, and maybe it's because they're going to the BBC's website and reading about the stabbings and wine bottles smashed in people's faces or whatever happens late at night. But so I think crime is obviously another one. I think also I come back to media as well. I think that. I think London. People talk about positioning the city from a design point of view and financial hub. I think a lot could also be done to make sure that not just the networks and news organizations that are based here currently, but also that more that we attract more news gathering organizations here as well, and make this a place which really functions and works for them.
Don't you love free newspapers?
Don't I love free newspapers? I can't say that. No, I don't pick them up. I don't think they come into our office, really. One thing when you mentioned Mr. Van Thillo, we had a profile on him in the magazine, and it was in that same issue that we did the Frankfurt Allgemeine in. I love this whole story of what's happened in Holland with NRC Handelsblatt's morning edition. This idea of going up against the free newspapers, but charging 50 cents or €1 for them, and actually, being able to make a fantastic business out of it. And again, it's about challenging format. and saying you don't have to just dumb down things. You don't have to give away news. You don't have to play into the whole commoditization of everything. And it was a wonderful quote from a girl saying, if I'm sitting on the tram and I wonder who's eligible, well, it's the person who spent the €1 rather than the one who's got the free paper.
Yeah. Any final questions for Tyler? Yes.
My name is Oliver, and I'm a big fan of the magazine, but I also read Der Spiegel. And I was wondering, could you see yourself being a weekly magazine at all? Or maybe fortnightly in the future?
Yeah, I don't think fortnightlies work. Weekly, Andrew, how do you feel about doing a weekly? Andrew's our editor. We thought about it. Yeah, it was one of the original ideas to do a weekly, but in fact, we're not even monthly. We're 10 times a year. But I think that works for right now. More special editions, definitely. What I'd rather do is really build up the metabolism, where there's. I mean, right now, we're putting up new films. Maybe let's say 1.5 times a week. I'd like to also have maybe dedicated programs and say that becomes our offer in terms of upping the metabolism of the site.
And you are trying to get back in with a final question, all right?
For such a multi-vision magazine, why did you choose Monocle?
Well, we couldn't get the original name that we wanted because the doctor in Australia didn't want to sell it to us.
Which was it?
It was originally called The Edit. That was
that's right.
that's what we were going to call it originally. And we couldn't get the name. And I was talking to, it was literally the moment that we found out we couldn't get The Edit and then theedit.com and everything else. I called Richard, our creative director, in, and I said, what are we going to do? And I said, I think we just need something which sounds very established. So if we call up the foreign ministry in Jakarta, it sounds like we've been around for a really long time. And I said it needs to be something odd, something that people don't talk about anymore, like monocles. And there you go. And also monocle.com was not available, but we got it at a good price. So that also helped.
I think that's a good place to end. A big thank you to Tyler Brule.
Thank you, John.